So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about lipids and how they link to cardiovascular disease. And for many of you, this is going to be a little bit of revision, as I'm sure many of you have covered this in your undergraduate degrees. So I just want to kind of get those thoughts coming back to you and thinking about, right, what do we know about lipoproteins? So lipoproteins are found in the blood. They're made up of fat, mixture of triglycerides and cholesterol, and protein. And they are classified by their density. So the more dense they are, so high density, the smaller the lipoprotein, and as they get bigger and bigger, the density is less. So we've got a combination of protein, cholesterol, and fats, phospholipids, all together in this lipoprotein. And they're extremely important in the bloodstream and their role, which we'll talk about in a minute. So lipoproteins, particularly low-density lipoproteins, carry cholesterol around the body. So we've got the cholesterol from cholesterol-containing foods, from the impact of saturated fats, but also those that are made in the body. So LDL carries cholesterol around the body. The problem with too much LDL is that it tends to stick to the walls of the blood vessels, causing narrowing or blockages, which is that part of the atherosclerosis process. And if you want to remind yourself about that process and how that might lead to a heart attack, have a look at this YouTube video, which covers it in much more detail. We also have high density lipoproteins. Remember, those are the really small ones. And they carry the cholesterol from the body back to the liver so that it can be broken down and excreted. And they are produced within the liver. They have an anti-inflammatory effect, so they protect against atherosclerosis. So you can already see the balance between the two is really important. It's not just about total cholesterol, it's about the balance between LDL and HDL. And we'll clarify a bit more of that in a minute. So HDL, that inhibits the production of sticky molecules in the endothelial cells. So they make things less sticky, and therefore we're less likely to get this development of atherosclerosis. And they carry an enzyme that prevents the LDLs from becoming inflammatory. So the difference between the two becomes really important, but we have to remember it is not all lifestyle related. Some of this is genetic. So our cholesterol levels depend on genes as well as lifestyle factors like smoking, saturated fat intake, alcohol consumption, and physical inactivity. So there is a relationship between our lifestyle, but there's also the genetic factors. It's just to kind of give you a bit of a diagram here about EPCs. Difficult to say, endothelial progenitor cells. And they are really important as far as regenerating that lining of the blood vessels. So we've got lots of different types of cells there that might be acting. And you can see from the diagram how they're kind of linking with the HDL. So really important cells. Again, how many we've got of those is an individual thing. It's genetics as well. So we've got a range of things going on that affect the types of cholesterol we have in our blood, the types of lipoproteins, and therefore the impact on cardiovascular disease. Another kind of lipids that gets less talked about, I think, is triglycerides, but they are actually the most common fats found in the blood. And they tend to be very much related to our dietary intake, particularly simple sugars, refined carbohydrates, and alcohol. So if you have high intakes of those foods and alcohol, then your triglyceride level is much more likely to be high. So there's an interaction there going on between diets, but also alcohol that we really need to be considering if triglyceride levels are very, very high. So there's been so much research over the years about which lipids we should be looking at, which ones are harmful, which aren't. Um, and that question, does it really matter if your blood cholesterol is really, really high? And I think you also need to think about, well, we spend a lot of money using statins to bring lipid levels down, and the evidence base for the effectiveness of them is very, very strong. So that could suggest also as well that high blood cholesterol levels are part of that broader picture of what might increase our cardiovascular disease risk. And this illustration might just help you to think about it. If you're thinking of our arteries as roads, the lipoproteins carrying the cholesterol as cars, and the cholesterol is passengers. And of course, cars come in all different shapes and sizes, as do lipoproteins. The total cholesterol and LDL measure the number of passengers, so that's the number of the amount of cholesterol on the roads. However, we now know that it's not how many passengers are in the car, in effect, but how many cars are on the road. So how many lipoproteins are out there that increase that cardiovascular disease risk. So these days, instead of worrying about LDLs and all sorts of different, very low density lipoproteins, lipoprotein A and ApoB, all of these different things, we now look at anything that is non-HDL. So if you think of the HDL as the one that's clearing up the cholesterol, clearing the road, the non-HDL are ones that are causing the congestion and therefore increasing the risk of accidents and problems. So maybe a helpful analysis in some ways for you. Analogy, should I say. So now we'll be looking at HDL and non-HDL. So non-HDL is the difference between the total cholesterol and the HDL cholesterol. So we can just do simple maths here. If your total cholesterol is 6, your HDL cholesterol is 0.8, that means 5.2 is non-HDL cholesterol. The non-HDL should be ideally less than 4 millimoles per litre for the general population. But people with existing cardiovascular disease, or those with an increase of more than 10% risk of developing cardiovascular disease within the next 10 years, should be trying to keep their blood cholesterol level, the non-HDL cholesterol level, below 3.4. And so we're using the non-HDL because it's the best measure of adding everything together and finding out what is the problematic lipids in our bloods if they are too high. And that is also accurate when triglycerides are high. And some triglyceride measurements are affected by a number of different things. So that's what we would be looking for, that non-HDL and the proportions. So the general expectation now, or the general thing we would be aiming for, is total cholesterol below 5, non-HDL below 4 for the general population, lower for people with existing cardiovascular disease, LDL below 3, HDL above 1 for a man and above 1.2 for a woman. And it's not a question of getting the HDL as high as you possibly can. There doesn't appear to be any advantage of it being above 1.4. So we're just trying to get the balance there. Total cholesterol versus HDL ratio above 6 is high risk, so we want that ratio to be less than 6 because that's going to be better. And triglycerides, which are kind of measured separately, you don't have to be fasting to take those, and they should be below 2.3, and these are all millimoles per litre. The last thing I want to think about in relation to lipids is the impact of physical activity. So physical activity is important for many, many reasons, but it does have an impact on lipids as well. So it reduces the low density lipoproteins and it increases the high density lipoprotein. So alongside the general physical activity recommendations, so think about those as well, what they were and what they were in relation for trying to manage weight. We need to encourage avoiding sedentary behaviour. We need to be aiming for 2.5 to 5 hours a week of moderate physical activity. So remember, that is physical activity that makes you slightly out of breath. Your heart rate's up a bit, but you can still talk. Or you're looking at the 1 to 2.5 hours of vigorous physical activity per week. More than 10-minute chunks, 4 to 5 days a week. We want aerobic exercise, and we're looking at, for those who already have existing heart disease, we're looking at more than 30 minutes, more than 3 days a week, more than equal 3 days a week, moderate to vigorous physical activity. That is something that people will build up to gradually after a coronary event. As you can imagine, it's quite a scary thing to do, and that's part of the reason why we encourage physical activity to be built up, and why people have physiotherapy advice and guidance on how to do that post a cardiac event or post a stroke. So we're trying to get people to be more active. It's very protective. It's a really important thing to encourage people to do, and we need to be thinking about how we're going to get people from where they're starting to where they're going to be, where they need to be.